what I'm going to do and share with you today is sort of walk you through the thought process and walk you through the steps that we take, not only for all of our startups that we work with, and then tailor that a little bit to the lens if any of you do startups on your own, tailor it a bit to medical devices and how to look at that market. So let's jump into it, shall we? Now, I bet looking at this, people are like, well, what is this even about? Why are we looking at a tooth with an infection? But let's do it through a lens of a story, shall we? Let's say there's an issue that you were trying to solve. So let's say in this case there's a root canal, right? So when you fill in a root canal, it doesn't always necessarily fit to the exact shape in the procedure. It has edges, it has nooks, crannies, and things like that. And what could happen is bacteria could leak in and can stay there and can cause that infection. So then you have to think, okay, well, how do I clean out this bacteria? How do I solve this issue? And then you get it. You have this idea, it comes to you. You're like, wow, maybe a device that could even be disposable that keeps the root canal clean and prevents such infections from happening. Amazing. You're on the horse. Let's get the show on the road, right? So maybe from surveying the market or talking to maybe even your local dentist, in this case, are going to could even pay $5 for a disposable cleaning device that can help prevent this bacteria. And you know that you can produce it and sell it to dental distributors who will get it to those doctors at a price of $2.50. Great. So you've got the plan to get it into the market. But how big is that market? What is your potential? Right? What is the total addressable market that you're trying to attain and unleash that potential? So we have to think for a second. When we're dealing with root canals, we should know how many of these procedures happen each year, right? A rough estimate. Think about it in those terms. So we think, just for argument's sake, we can see that there could be 15 million cases in the United States, 29 million in the EU and Europe. EU and Europe are kind of the same thing. Sorry, guys. And the UK. Not so much with the UK and Europe now, right? and 35 million in the rest of the world. So then you can see from that there are 79 million approximate procedures that are done each year. So, okay, great. So from the total addressable market perspective, plus the price that we're going to sell it at, you could figure that our potential is about 200 million. But there's a catch. What's that catch? That's if every single doctor, every single dentist is using your product. Seems kind of unrealistic, right? So you have to think maybe best case scenario, if you really, really strike it big, you get 5%. But this raises another question that we have to think about when building a business plan. We have to think about, oh, hello. we have to think about the investment, right? Because when we're building a business plan, it's not only about whether or not you can solve a problem that you see in the market, but if there's going to be interest in that from a potential investor. So if you say, even if you took 5%, best case scenario, $10 million valuation, roughly, and that's not even for revenue, that's not even including your expenses. So if I'm an investor looking at this, saying, well, why would I bother investing in something that's only going to be valued at $10 million? Why would we do that? You see, it's not just when you're building a business plan, even if it is the greatest life-saving solution in the world, there is unfortunately the muddy business side of it you have to take into account when building your plan. So let's take a step back here for a second. Let's talk about things at home, just for reference. When we think about the market itself, we think about the potential. This is Startup Nation, right, overall? I mean, I've been hearing that ever since I was a kid. I'm sure you have as well. So the Israeli medical device market, let's say, is valued at $2.4 billion. Then we can see that, okay, great, there's potential. great, there's a slice of the pie that I could get. And if you want to go into medical devices, you better get ready for some competition. Because from this chart alone, we can see that the largest number of registered companies within the life science field are within medical devices. That's more than diagnostics, more than drugs, more than telemedicine itself. So that says, okay, great. Furthers your point that the market is robust. Furthers your point that there is potential of the pie for you to get. Let's take a step back again and think about what's our end game here, aside from going into the market, aside from bringing a solution to the world, a powerful solution to the world. It's about, in some cases, an opportunity for exit, being acquired by almost like a benefactor of sorts. You think about patrons and art, right? Some of these larger corporations being your benefactors. For example, with EPD Solutions, that was acquired by Philips in 2017. Anyone familiar with EPD? Yes. Right, cool. Oh, amazing! Do you want to talk about it? No. Very, very cool. So yeah, EPD does the cardiac imaging, real time, right? 3D imaging, rendering, mapping, really cool stuff. Sticking with the heart here, Valtech Cardio, acquired by Edwards in 2018, doing the replacement and repair of mitral valves in the heart, devices for that repair and replacement. And then let's bring it to Mazor here, one of your own, right? Professor Shoam, bought up by Medtronic, or acquired, I should say. It's not like a hostile takeover, merger and acquisition. Sorry. Worked on Wall Street previously. Anyway, but yeah. Actually, interestingly enough, Professor Shoam recently partnered up with a former client of ours and Dr. Kira Radinsky to form a diagnostic robotics, if anybody's familiar. Raised $24 million recently. So that's sort of the end of the story here, right? So we talked about defining the problem, getting on the horse as we mentioned, analyzing the potential, and then kind of walking the story to its conclusion. But the reason why I'm here tonight, and why you're all sitting so nice and quietly for me, is to answer the question, how do you become one of them? How do you either build a business plan, create a medical startup? What do you need to do? What are the tools that you need? And what are the steps that you need to take to get there? Let's get into it, shall we? From the investor perspective, we think about it in terms of what an investor is looking for. You need three things: smart team, an accomplished team, a well-rounded team, an innovative and new product, an improvement on an existing product, and a big market to maximize your potential. So, in order to do that, to bring all of those pieces together, well, that's where, say, a company like mine would come in building a business plan. So now I'll walk you through sort of our philosophy. Now, granted, like any company, Targo has competitors, and there's always different ways of reaching your destination. But I'll walk you through tonight sort of our philosophy of doing it and the parts that we always include in our business plans for whatever the startup may be. So first we start out by defining the solution, right? So let's say we're having a meeting and we're building a business plan. It is essential, let's say if you're working with a company like mine or even on your own, to best communicate your vision as clearly as possible. How it works. What's your vision? How are you going to what's your mission in the market itself? Where do things stand? An investor, when you're building a business plan, always wants to know where things stand. Is it just an idea? Do you have a functioning prototype? And then the next point here, are you in possession of any intellectual property? Do you have a provisional patent? Have you applied in one country versus another? And then, of course, how severe is the problem you're trying to solve? And what value are you going to bring to the patients or to the, let's say, your clients in general, the users? That could be doctors, that could be hospitals. I mentioned before, we define how severe the problem is. We also have to define the market that you're going to sit in, or try to compete in, I should say. Let's make it more active. It's tough out there, right? Dog eat dog. So when you're defining the market, I'll take a step back and talk about this sort of general. When our philosophy in writing business plans, generally speaking, when we do a market research or a market review, is to answer two questions. The first of which, as I mentioned before in terms of the root canal cleaning device, is there a potential in the market? How big is the market? How many people can you potentially reach with your solution? And then, not so much in medical devices, but in other cases, in other startups, mobile applications, things like that, it's about where you go to market, right? So not so much for medical devices, but when you have other consumer products or even mobile solutions, there's something that we always try to convey to our clients, which is you have to attain critical mass. That first initial burst of users to really get you moving, because then that will increase your chances of receiving your next round of funding when the time comes. Now, for medical devices, as I mentioned before, it's how severe the problem is. I mentioned with root canals. Who is your client in this case? Right, as I said a minute ago, is it going to be the patient? Is it going to be, not off the shelf, over the counter? Is it going to be doctors? Is it going to be hospitals? Or are it going to be even just medical device distributors? And then, who pays? And the question of who pays is really, really important, particularly if you're dealing with a healthcare system like the country of my birth, where you have to deal with a lot of different insurance companies and policies and things like that. There's such things as insurance reimbursement codes, right? So it's not necessarily going to be the patient, even for a procedure, that's going to pay for something. Maybe there's a copay, but the insurance company will cover it. So you need to know, do I need a reimbursement code? And if you're bringing a new and innovative idea to the market, it might take you years to do it. I'll give you an example. Who here, show of hands, has heard of the pill cam? Yeah, okay, cool. So, Given Images, the company that developed it, it took them years to get an insurance reimbursement code because it was something that was new to the market. And then once you have that, then you're all squared away. But that could affect your time to market in the long term. And of course, in this case, there's always going to be the regulation, the biggest sort of inhibitor to your time to market, right? You have to know the ropes. You have to know if, let's say, your solution, what the classifications would be, if it's, if you're going to apply the FDA or HSA or CE. You have to know, how it'll affect your time to market. I'll give you an example also. If we talk about even competing solutions. Competing solutions in the same market could have different classifications. We had a client who is developing an innovative post-operative adhesion barrier. Now, in the competition, when we did a competitor analysis, we saw that one of the competitors whose adhesion barrier required a secondary surgery and was only made of a simple polymer was, say, FDA Class 2. But another type of adhesion barrier, which had bioactive ingredients that dissolved within the body was a class 3. So those distinctions are important when you have to decide, where, how are we going to apply? Are we going to do a 510K or a pre-market evaluation? And then how will that affect the next phase of what we're talking about here, clinical trials, right? What is necessary to be completed before your submission? Do you need animal trials, first in human trials? Do you need a packing validation? Do you need to continuously do repeated human trials to prove our next point here, safety versus efficacy, right? You could have the most efficient solution in the world, but if there's even a hint of danger, if there's something, that could, God forbid, kill anybody, it's not going anywhere. So even if, let's say we talked about adhesion barriers, where you're still getting an incidence rate of post-operative adhesions of, say, 49 or 50%, if it's safe, then you're going to have a much higher chance, obviously, of getting that approval. I mentioned a second ago with the adhesion barriers, doing a competitor analysis. When we build business plans, this often is the biggest section. Why, in terms of getting investment? Why is this the biggest section? Because an investor is going to want to know, have you done your homework? Do you know what's out there on the market? Are there potentially better solutions? Like, why should I choose to invest in your solution when this exists on the market? It's also important to know, where do they stand with their intellectual property? Is your solution infringing on that intellectual property? How far along are they in the regulatory submission process? What are their use cases? Do they do open surgery, closed surgery, for example? But also, most importantly, to show them in this section, what is your edge? We talked about value before, just to your customer or your final end user, but also versus your competitors. Where do you stand? What makes your product unique? I guarantee you from our experience that concept is king in this case, or queen. I don't want to discriminate. It's extremely important to have a differentiating concept than something. I'll give you an example, something that we've encountered a lot when building our business plans with all over the spectrum of ideas here. We like to call it like octopus syndrome, because there are some people that come to build a business plan with us, and they're always trying to get they'll look at the competition and say, okay, they're doing this, but we want to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this better, and then we're going to transport people to the moon, and we're going to be doing all this. So they're trying to get their tentacles and everything. And then what happens? The product begins to look unfocused. It loses the edge that we're trying to define in the first place. So another thing, we call it in other instances, is a revenue model, but in this case we'll call it monetization. That's important to go in any business plan that you're building. How are you going to make money? Right? And from the investor perspective, they want to see not only that you're making money and succeeding, but that they can get them your return on investment, or get them their return on their investment. With medical devices, from our experience, we've encountered sort of three main avenues of monetizing, whether it's just selling directly, selling one part directly and having either disposable or reusable pieces that consumers keep buying each time around, or just licensing the technology itself, and then make someone else sort of do the hard work for you. Here's the Mona Lisa of examples. I was waiting for that. It was intentional. Anyway, so anyone here familiar with the Da Vinci system? Cool. So we can see that they kind of include everything that we just talked about. We have the cost for the device itself. We have reusable pieces. They need to be changed out or cleaned or things like that. Disposable and consumable pieces. And not even that, get this. they're squeezing the hospitals or the final consumer like a lemon here. You have the training of the surgeons for each person, in addition to maintenance costs. Perfection right there, I'll tell you. So let's take a step back here for a second. In this part of our business planning process, we often talk about, within the business model section, or the go-to-market plan, in this case. So generally speaking, when we're building a business plan for any sort of startup that comes across our desk, the go-to-market strategy and the business model section is defined in a couple of parts. First of which is, who's your target market? Not so much in medical devices in this case, but we talked about before, there's certain regions that we can go to market first and then expand the business out from there. We have our target audience. The target audience is who are going to be your final end users or consumers. Are they going to be patients? Are they going to be regular people over the counter? Are they going to be doctors? Are they going to be hospitals? The next part is defining, as we mentioned, the revenue model. And then the go-to-market is how you action all of that. So with medical devices, it's a little more straightforward. In some cases, you could just present to a distributor, contact and present to a distributor, and then they would do sort of the grunt work for you, getting it to hospitals, getting it to clinics, things like that. Another good way to get to market, get yourself out there, we talked about exits before, is to go to conferences, to get you to rub shoulders with potential investors or even some bigger players in the market that, as we saw before, could help you, complete an exit, whether it's MDM West or Medical Japan, anywhere in the world. But you have to think and allocate for this accordingly in your budget. We'll get to that in a minute. Or in a second. When we talk about building a business plan, generally speaking, the key reader that you're trying to address are going to be investors. And what do investors want to see? They want to see numbers, right? I mentioned before, they want to see that your product is going to get them a return on their investment. So when we do this for our clients, it usually contains these parts. Revenue, your general administrative expenses, your operational expenses, your personnel, and particularly for devices, research and development, and CapEx are tremendous expenses. And then, of course, an investor is going to want to see the budget. They're going to want to see how much money they're going to need to give you if they choose to invest, and how you're going to spend that money. So I'll give you an example here. So we can see here on CapEx that it's doing the trials. It's doing the submission costs, buying equipment to produce it, sometimes paying third-party prototyping companies to do molds and create your initial prototype. And then, of course, you'll have to take into account the team. We mentioned before, smart teams, right? Who's going to need to be on board, and how many of each person, of each type of person is going to need to be in the team? You're going to have a chief technology officer, engineers on staff, or in the case of mobile applications, an army of programmers, right? And then, of course, like any business, you're going to have to operate day to day. So we have to define what our operating costs are. I mentioned before, travels. We go to those conferences, to go meet with clients, to go present to distributors. It's going to cost money. Rent for offices or lab space. Insurances for employee. Financial expenses if you take out loans to build your business. And then, of course, your marketing budget. Now, in the case of medical devices, as I mentioned before, it's a little different. You're going to be mostly attending a lot of conferences. You're going to try to attend a lot of conferences, rub shoulders with some big players. But those add up. In addition to that, we always recommend sort of doing PR campaigns, publications, getting your name out there. And then, of course, if you hire distributors, giving them their cut of the business, for helping you bring in revenue. And your sales team. When you're business to business generally, you're going to rely on that sales team. And not only will you have to pay them salaries, but commissions on the sales that they bring in. So this is an example here of a revenue model that we once built, where it's derived from the sales from the distributors and the sales generated, or the revenues generated by the sales team, on the assumption that they make X amount of sales, in this case, beginning after the initial launch, in this case in the APAC region. But another thing to take into account to your cash flow is how much is it going to cost to produce that device. That's going to eat away a chunk of your revenue right there. And finally, how does it all add up, right? In that first year. Now, generally speaking, when we build a business plan, as we mentioned at the beginning, most of our clients are either from the idea stage or from a really early stage. So sometimes you really have to think about that first seed round of funding. So that might be your first year, or maybe, let's say, in the case of applications, at most 6 months to development, and then a beta development, and then a launch, right? So then you have to account for maybe just that year of all those expenses we talked about. And then this would show your investor how much they're going to have to give you and where that money is going to be spent, as I mentioned at the top of this section. That's all she wrote.